My mother stood in the kitchen doorway with 2 suitcases and said, "I did not marry a man who lives in garbage." She was wearing the blue dress she saved for church and job interviews, the one that meant she wanted to be seen as something better than what she was standing in. My father was at the kitchen table, still in his work boots, grease under his fingernails, eating reheated chili from a pot I had watched him cook the night before. He did not look up. He did not argue. He did not ask her to stay. He took another bite of chili and said, "Drive safe, Diane." My brother, Kyle, 16 years old, stood behind her with his backpack over one shoulder and his eyes on the floor. He did not look at me either. He did not say goodbye. He followed her out the front door, into her sister's Honda Civic, and down the gravel driveway that led away from our house and away from the 6-acre junkyard where my father had worked every day of his life since he was 22 years old. I was 14. I stood at the screen door and watched the taillights disappear past the tree line. My father came up behind me, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You hungry? There is more chili." That was it. That was the night my family broke in half. No screaming, no slamming doors, no dramatic confrontation, just a woman in a blue dress walking out on a man who sorted metal for a living, and a boy choosing to follow her because he was old enough to be embarrassed and too young to know that embarrassment is not the same thing as judgment. I stayed. I do not know why exactly. I was 14, and 14-year-olds do not make philosophical decisions about loyalty. I stayed because the chili was warm and the house was familiar and my father was standing behind me with his hand on my shoulder, and it felt like the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted under my feet. I stayed because something in me, something I could not name and would not understand for another 19 years, knew that the man they were leaving behind was not what they said he was. 19 years later, a lawyer in a downtown office looked at me across a mahogany table and said, "Mr. Novak, your mother and brother are not included in this meeting. Your father was very specific about that." He opened a folder. His hands were shaking, and everything I thought I knew about my father, about the junkyard, about the life my mother called garbage, turned out to be worth $33 million. My name is Eric Novak. I need to tell you about my father. Robert Novak, Bobby to everyone who knew him, grew up in Calumet City, Illinois, on the far south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the air smelled like rust and diesel and the American dream was a union card and a pension. His father, my grandfather, worked at the steel mills until they closed. His mother cleaned houses. Bobby dropped out of high school at 17, got his GED at 19, and at 22, used every dollar he had saved from 3 years of odd jobs to buy a 4-acre plot of land off Route 394 that came with a chain-link fence, a corrugated metal shed, and a sign that read Novak Salvage and Auto Parts. He added 2 more acres in 1991 when the adjacent lot went up for tax sale. Total investment, $41,000 for 6 acres of flat, ugly land surrounded by cornfields and power lines. For the next 30 years, my father ran that junkyard. He bought wrecked cars from insurance auctions, pulled them apart piece by piece, and sold the parts. He bought scrap metal from construction sites and demolition crews. He took in old appliances, farm equipment, industrial machinery, anything made of metal that someone else did not want anymore. He worked 6 days a week, sunrise to sunset, in steel-toed boots and canvas gloves, with a cutting torch in one hand and a socket wrench in the other. He came home every night smelling like motor oil and iron filings. He ate dinner at the same table, watched the same evening news, and went to bed at 9:30 because the yard opened at 7. My mother called it a waste. She said it before she left, and she said it for years before that. She wanted a husband who wore a tie, who worked in an office, who had a title she could mention at her sister's dinner parties without watching the table go quiet. She married Bobby Novak when she was 20 because he was handsome and funny and he made her feel safe. But safe was not enough. Not when her sister married a pharmaceutical sales rep and moved to Naperville. Not when her friends from high school started posting vacation photos and kitchen renovations on Facebook. Not when the distance between her life and the life she wanted became a canyon she could not stop staring into. I do not blame her for wanting more. I blame her for how she left, for what she said, for the fact that she never once, in 19 years, called my father to apologize or explain or even ask how he was doing. She filed for divorce 6 weeks after she left. She asked for the house. My father gave it to her without argument. He moved into a small apartment above the junkyard's office, a 2-room space with a hot plate, a mini fridge, and a mattress on the floor. He let her have the house because it was easier than fighting, and because Bobby Novak was the kind of man who would rather lose a house than lose a day of work to a courtroom. I lived with my father. The court gave my mother primary custody, but I refused to go. At 14, in Illinois, a judge will consider a child's preference, and I made mine clear. I wanted to stay with my dad. My mother argued. My father did not. The judge granted my request. My mother took Kyle and the house and the furniture and left me with a man who lived above a junkyard and ate reheated chili for dinner. It was the best decision I have ever made. The first year was hard. I will not romanticize it. The apartment above the office was cold in winter and sweltering in summer. The shower was a rubber hose attached to a utility sink. I did my homework at a folding table while my father did his books at the desk 3 feet away, squinting at invoices under a bare bulb. I went to school smelling like the yard no matter how hard I scrubbed, and the kids noticed. They always notice. Someone spray-painted "Junkyard Kid" on my locker sophomore year. I cleaned it off before my father could see it. Not because I was ashamed of him, because I did not want him to know that other people were. There were moments when I questioned my decision. When I was 15, Kyle posted photos on Facebook from my mother's new house in Naperville. He had his own room with a TV and a computer. There was a pool in the backyard. The kitchen had granite countertops and a refrigerator with an ice dispenser. I was sleeping in a room where the wind came through the window frame, and the only computer was a 10-year-old desktop my father used for inventory tracking. I looked at those photos for a long time. Then I closed the laptop and went downstairs and helped my father unload a flatbed of wrecked Hondas that had come in from an insurance auction. We worked until the sun went down, and when we came upstairs, he made scrambled eggs and toast and we ate in silence, and it was enough. At school, I was invisible. Not bullied exactly, just unseen. The guidance counselor called me in junior year to discuss my college plans. She looked at my file, saw my address, and said, "Eric, have you considered vocational training? There are some excellent programs at the community college." She had not looked at my grades. She had looked at my zip code. I was carrying a 3.8 GPA, and she was steering me toward trade school because my home address was a junkyard on Route 394. I said, "I will figure it out." The same thing my father said about everything. I will figure it out. Grandpa Walt, my father's father, died when I was 16. He left my father nothing because there was nothing to leave. But at the funeral, an old steelworker named Teddy pulled my father aside and said something I overheard. He said, "Bobby, your old man was proud of that yard. He told everyone at the VFW that his son was going to build something out there that would make them all look twice." My father nodded and said nothing. But that night he stayed up late in the office. I could see the light from my window. He was writing something, making plans. I did not know what they were. I was 16. I was just glad the light was on. It meant he was still there. But there was something else in that first year. Something that grew slowly the way metal oxidizes, changing the surface of everything it touches. My father started teaching me the business. Not formally. Not with lectures or textbooks. He taught me the way he did everything. By doing it in front of me and letting me watch until I understood. He taught me how to read a car. Not drive it. Read it. How to look at a wrecked vehicle and know within seconds what was salvageable. The engine, the transmission, the alternator, the starter motor, the catalytic converter. He taught me which metals were worth pulling and which were not. Copper wiring. Aluminum radiators. The platinum and palladium inside catalytic converters, which he removed with surgical precision, cataloged by weight, and stored separately in a locked room at the back of the yard that I assumed held spare parts. "Everything has value, Eric," he would say, holding up a corroded catalytic converter that looked like a piece of garbage. "You just have to know where to look and what to look for. Most people see trash. I see elements. Palladium, rhodium, platinum. The car is worth a few $100 for parts. But this little piece right here, this is worth more than the rest of the car combined. And nobody knows. Because nobody looks. He said things like that. Simple sentences that I filed away at the time and would not fully understand for years. He was not just talking about catalytic converters. He was talking about himself. About me. About the life my mother had called garbage without ever bothering to look inside it. Every Saturday for 19 years, I worked with my father at the yard. Through high school, through community college, through my apprenticeship as an electrician, through the early years of building my own contracting business. Every Saturday, I would arrive at 7 in the morning and we would work until 5 in the afternoon, pulling parts, cutting metal, sorting scrap, loading the flatbed for the recycler. We ate lunch together in his little office, sitting on folding chairs with the radio tuned to the oldies station, eating sandwiches from the gas station down the road. We did not talk much. We did not need to. The work was the conversation. The presence was the point. Those Saturdays were the architecture of my life. They were the foundation everything else was built on. When I was stressed about a job or worried about money or lonely in the specific way that a man who grew up in a junkyard is lonely, all I had to do was drive out to Route 394 and walk through those gates and pick up a wrench and start pulling parts. The rhythm of the work settled me. The sound of metal on metal, the smell of oil and rust, the weight of a transmission in my arms. It was meditation. It was therapy. It was church. Some of my best memories are the simplest. A Tuesday in February 2012, when a snowstorm knocked out the power and we worked the yard with flashlights and a generator, laughing at the absurdity of it, our breath crystallizing in the air. A Saturday in June 2015, when a customer drove in with a 1969 Camaro SS that had been rear-ended, and my father stood there looking at it the way some men look at sunsets and said, "That is a shame. That was a beautiful car." He spent 3 hours that afternoon carefully removing the intact front clip, the dashboard, the seats, and the engine, preserving everything with a tenderness I had never seen him show toward anything except me. He sold those parts over the next year to collectors for more than the car was worth whole. A Saturday in October 2020, 2 weeks after his first cancer diagnosis. He was tired, moving slower, but he was there. We worked side by side, stripping a fleet of retired delivery vans, and at lunch he looked at me and said, out of nowhere, "Eric, thank you for staying." It was the only time in 19 years he said it directly. I said, "Where else would I be?" He nodded. That was the entire conversation. 6 words from him, 5 from me. It was enough. My father was not a talker. He was a noticer. He noticed everything. Which yards were going out of business and selling their inventory cheap. Which demolition companies were cutting corners on scrap disposal. Which metals were trending up in price and which were cycling down. He read trade publications the way other men read sports pages. He could quote spot prices for copper, aluminum, and steel the way a stockbroker quotes the Dow. He knew the recycling market the way he knew every wrench in his toolbox. Intimately, precisely, from decades of daily use. He was also, I would later learn, reading something else entirely. Real estate listings, county tax records, zoning board minutes, infrastructure development plans. He read them at night, after I went home, in his apartment above the office under that bare bulb, with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. I did not know about any of this. Not the metal storage room. Not the real estate. Not the plans he was making. I knew my father as a man who owned a junkyard and worked it honestly and lived simply and never complained about the wife who left him or the son who followed her out the door. Kyle and I did not speak for the first 5 years after the split. He was in Naperville with my mother, going to a good high school, playing soccer, dating girls who did not know his father sorted scrap metal for a living. My mother remarried in 2008, a man named Gerald who sold medical devices and drove a Lexus and had never once had grease under his fingernails. Kyle took Gerald's last name for a while, then changed it back after the marriage fell apart 3 years later. He went to a state university, studied business administration, and got a job at a logistics company where he made decent money and described his upbringing as complicated when anyone asked. He called me once in 2012 when he was 24 and I was 22. He said he wanted to reconnect. We met at a diner halfway between his apartment and the yard. It was awkward. He asked about Dad. I said Dad was fine. He asked about the business. I said the business was fine. He asked if Dad ever talked about him. I said no because it was the truth. My father never mentioned Kyle. Not out of anger. Out of something quieter. A door that had been closed so gently you could not even tell it was shut until you tried to walk through it. Kyle did not visit the yard. He did not call Dad. He did not send a birthday card or a Christmas text or an email. The reconnection lasted one diner lunch and then dissolved back into silence. My mother was worse. In 19 years, she contacted my father 3 times. The first was in 2009, when Gerald's medical device business hit a rough patch and she needed money. She called the yard's landline and asked Bobby for $8,000. He wired it to her the next day. She did not say thank you. The second was in 2014, when Kyle needed help with a security deposit on an apartment. She called again. My father sent $3,000. No acknowledgement. The third was in 2019, when she needed dental surgery that her insurance would not cover. My father paid the $11,000 bill without hesitation. 3 contacts in 19 years, all of them withdrawals. Not once did she ask how he was. Not once did she visit. Not once did she say she was sorry. I know this because my father kept records. Every contact, every dollar sent, every phone call logged with the date, the time, the duration, and the amount requested. He filed them in a folder in his desk drawer the way he filed invoices from part sales. Methodically, without emotion, just data. A man who spent his life sorting valuable material from worthless material, doing the same thing with the people who had left him behind. In 2020, my father was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Stage 2. Treatable. He told me on a Saturday afternoon in the yard, sitting in his office with the radio playing, as casually as if he were telling me about a new batch of cars coming in from auction. Got some cancer, Eric. Doctor says we caught it early. I will be fine. He was not fine. The treatment was brutal. Radiation, hormone therapy, the exhausting cycle of appointments and side effects, and the slow erosion of a body that had worked hard every day for 45 years. But he kept going to the yard. Every day. He worked shorter hours, took more breaks, sat in his chair more than he stood at the bench. But he was there. Every single day. I moved back into the apartment above the office during his treatment. I ran the yard in the mornings while he rested. I drove him to his appointments. I cooked him dinner on the hot plate, real dinner, not gas station sandwiches, because somewhere in the previous 19 years I had learned to cook, and somewhere in the process of watching my father face cancer alone, I had learned that feeding someone is the most basic form of love there is. He went into remission in 2021. For a year, things felt almost normal. We celebrated, quietly, the way we did everything, with a Saturday at the yard and steaks on a portable grill behind the office and 2 bottles of beer and the radio playing and the sun going down behind the flatbed. He looked at me that evening with an expression I had rarely seen on his face. Not happiness exactly. Satisfaction. The satisfaction of a man who had built something with his hands and survived long enough to see it standing. The cancer came back in 2023. This time, stage 4. Metastatic. The oncologist was a young woman who spoke carefully, the way people speak when they are delivering news that will rearrange someone's life. She used words like palliative and quality of life, and making him comfortable. My father listened to all of it, nodded and said, "How long?" The doctor said maybe a year with treatment, maybe less without. My father said, "I have work to finish." He worked for another 11 months. Every day. Even when he could barely stand. Even when the pain medication made his hands shake and his vision blur. Even when I begged him to rest, to take a day off, to sit in the apartment and watch television like a normal person facing what he was facing. He would shake his head and say, "The yard does not run itself, Eric." But increasingly, the work he was doing was not yard work. He was at his desk in the office, going through files, making phone calls I did not understand to people I did not know, working on something that had nothing to do with the daily operations of the business. Legal documents, financial statements, land surveys, phone calls to Arthur Brennan that lasted an hour or more, behind a closed door. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "Paperwork. The boring stuff." He smiled when he said it. The only time he smiled those last months was when he was working on whatever was in those files. I realize now that he was finishing the architecture, putting the last pieces in place, making sure that every trust was funded, every document signed, every acre accounted for. He was building his legacy the same way he built everything else. Carefully, completely, with no loose ends and no wasted material. My mother and Kyle appeared in January 2024. 19 years of silence, and they showed up at the hospital where my father was spending what we both knew were his final weeks. I was in the hallway getting coffee when I saw them. My mother was older, thinner, with the careful posture of a woman who had spent 2 decades pretending her first marriage never happened. Kyle was 36, taller than I remembered, wearing a blazer and the uncomfortable expression of a man who knows he is somewhere he does not belong. My mother said, "Eric, we heard about your father." 19 years, I said. "You heard about him 19 years ago, Mom. You just did not care until now. That is not fair. Is that why you are here? To be fair." Kyle stepped forward. "I am still his son, Eric. You have not been his son since you walked out the front door with a backpack over your shoulder and did not look back. You do not get to be his son now because he is dying. That is not how this works." They went to his room anyway. I did not stop them. My father was awake. He looked at my mother and then at Kyle and then at me. The room was quiet except for the monitors and the sound of Kyle shifting his weight from foot to foot. My father looked at me and said, clear and steady despite the morphine, "The ones who stay are the ones who inherit. Remember that." He closed his eyes. My mother started crying. Kyle stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. They left 20 minutes later. My father did not open his eyes again while they were there. He died on February 6, 2024. A Tuesday morning. I was holding his hand. The room was quiet except for the monitors and the sound of my own breathing. He had not spoken in 2 days. But in the last hour his grip tightened once, just barely, a pressure so faint that a nurse would have missed it. I did not miss it. I had spent 19 years learning to notice the things other people overlook. The monitors flatlined. The nurse came in and checked his pulse and noted the time. 6:47 a.m. The yard opened at 7. He almost made it. I sat with him for 20 minutes after the nurse left. I held his hand and I told him things I had never said out loud. That he was the best man I had ever known. That the junkyard was not garbage. That the life he built was not a waste. That every Saturday, every sandwich, every silent lunch with the radio playing was a brick in the foundation of who I had become. I told him I would take care of the yard. I told him I would take care of everything. I do not know if he heard me. I choose to believe he did. The funeral was small. I organized it. I paid for it. The guys who worked part-time at the yard came. A few of the regular customers. The owner of the diner where we bought sandwiches. A woman from the county clerk's office who had known my father for years, but whose significance I would not understand until later. My mother and Kyle came. They sat in the back. They did not speak to me. They did not speak at all. 3 weeks later, I received a call from a man named Arthur Brennan. He identified himself as my father's attorney and asked me to come to his office in downtown Chicago for the reading of the will. I said I did not know my father had an attorney. He said, "Your father had a great deal that you did not know about, Mr. Novak. That is rather the point." I asked about my mother and Kyle. Arthur said, "Your father's instructions are explicit. This meeting is for you alone. Your mother and brother are not included in the proceedings." I drove downtown on a Thursday morning. Arthur Brennan's office was on the 31st floor of a building on LaSalle Street. Dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of office that charges $400 an hour and earns every penny. Arthur was about 60, silver-haired, precise in his movements, with the measured speech of a man who had spent decades choosing his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. He shook my hand and said, "Your father was the most remarkable client I have ever represented. Please sit down." He opened a folder. I noticed his hands. They were shaking. Not from age. Not from caffeine. From something else. The weight of what he was about to say. Or maybe the disbelief that still hit him after all these years. that a man who sorted scrap metal in steel-toed boots had quietly assembled a fortune that most of his LaSalle Street neighbors would envy. "Your father came to me in 2006, Arthur began. 2 years after your mother left. He walked into this office in his work boots and his canvas jacket with grease on the sleeves. The receptionist almost did not let him pass the lobby. He sat in that chair where you are sitting now and asked me if I could help him build something that nobody would see. I asked him what he meant. He said, 'I want to turn a junkyard into an empire, and I want my son to inherit it, and I want the people who left us to never touch a dime.' That is an exact quote. I wrote it down because I knew, even then, that your father was not an ordinary man." Arthur poured me a glass of water. I had not asked for one. He poured it because he knew I would need it. "The first thing you should know," he said, "is about the locked room. The locked room at the back of the yard. The one with the reinforced steel door and the combination padlock that my father changed every 6 months. The one I had walked past 1,000 Saturdays without ever asking what was inside. I had assumed it held spare parts, overflow inventory, maybe some equipment too valuable to leave in the open yard. My father had never offered to show me, and I had never asked, because the unspoken rule of our relationship was that I trusted him completely and he would tell me what I needed to know when I needed to know it." Arthur laid out the story, the real story, the one I had spent 19 years living beside without seeing. The locked room at the back of the yard. The one I thought held spare parts. It did not hold spare parts. It held metal, not scrap metal, precious metal. For 30 years, my father had been systematically extracting and refining high-value metals from the vehicles and machinery that came through his yard. Catalytic converters yielded platinum, palladium, and rhodium, metals that had skyrocketed in value over the past 2 decades. Copper wiring, pulled by hand from every vehicle, was cleaned, graded, and stored. Circuit boards from newer cars were stripped for gold, silver, and palladium. Industrial machinery that came in for scrapping contained components made of tungsten, cobalt, titanium, and other specialty metals that my father identified, removed, cataloged, and stored with the same precision he brought to every other aspect of his work. He did not sell them, not right away. He stored them, year after year, ton after ton, in a climate-controlled room behind a reinforced steel door that I had walked past 1,000 times without ever asking what was inside. He waited for prices to peak, sold in strategic batches through a licensed precious metals dealer in Indiana, and reinvested the proceeds. Arthur Brennan managed the financial side. The precious metals dealer, a man named Frank Corrigan who had been buying from my father since 1998, confirmed the long relationship and the staggering volume. Current value of the stored metals and accumulated investment proceeds, $9.2 million. I stared at Arthur. He was not finished. "The metals were only part of it," he said. "The larger asset is the land." He stood up and walked to a map mounted on the wall behind his desk. I had not noticed it before. It was a county survey map of the Route 394 corridor, laminated with hand-drawn markings in red and blue ink. 7 parcels, outlined in red, surrounding a central 6-acre block outlined in blue. The blue block was the junkyard. The red parcels were the land my father had been quietly buying for over 2 decades. Starting in 1993, 1 year before my mother left, my father had begun purchasing the parcels of land surrounding the junkyard. They were cheap, farmland mostly, vacant lots that nobody wanted because they were too close to a salvage yard and too far from anything else. He bought them at tax sales, at estate auctions, from farmers who were retiring and could not find buyers. 7 parcels over 15 years, totaling 112 acres. He paid between $4,000 and $18,000 per parcel. Total land investment, approximately $67,000. He kept buying even during the recession, Arthur said. 2008, 2009, when land prices in that corridor hit rock bottom, your father bought 3 parcels in 18 months. He said to me, "Arthur, when nobody wants something, that is when you buy it. Because somebody will want it eventually. You just have to be patient enough to wait." He was the most patient man I have ever known. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. It was flat, empty land next to a junkyard on Route 394. My mother had driven past those fields 1,000 times and never wondered who owned them. Kyle had grown up seeing nothing but horizon in every direction and concluded, like everyone else, that there was nothing there worth seeing. But my father saw something. He saw the same thing he saw in every wrecked car that came through his gates. Not what it was, what it could become. In 2021, a major technology company began scouting locations for a new data center in the South Chicago suburbs. They needed flat land, access to power infrastructure, proximity to fiber optic trunk lines, and enough acreage to build a facility that would serve their cloud computing operations for the next 30 years. The corridor along Route 394, with its existing power grid connections from the old industrial era and its direct access to the interstate, was ideal. My father's 112 acres sat in the center of it. Arthur Brennan had been negotiating with the tech company's real estate team for 18 months before my father died. The offer on the table for the junkyard and all 7 surrounding parcels was $24.1 million. Arthur paused and let the number sit in the room. $24.1 million. For land that my father had bought for $67,000 over 15 years of patient, invisible accumulation. Combined with the precious metals portfolio, the total estate was worth approximately $33 million. Your father asked me to tell you something, Arthur said. He opened a separate envelope and read aloud. The letter was short. My father was not a man of many words. Eric, I know you thought I was just sorting scrap. I was sorting our future. Every catalytic converter, every acre, every Saturday you showed up. It was all part of the same thing. I did not build this for the money. I built it because a man should leave something behind that proves he was here. Your mother said I would never be anything. She was wrong. I was something every day. I was your father. That was enough for me. But I wanted to make sure it was enough for you too. The ones who stay are the ones who inherit. You stayed. This is yours. All of it. Love, Dad. I could not speak. Arthur sat quietly across from me while I held that letter and tried to breathe through the pressure in my chest. My father, Bobby Novak, the junkyard man, the man my mother left because he sorted trash. He had built $33 million from wrecked cars and empty land and the kind of patience that most people mistake for resignation. I drove back to the yard that afternoon. I parked in my usual spot, next to the flatbed, and walked past the rows of stripped vehicles to the back of the property. The locked room, the reinforced door, the combination padlock. I knew the combination now. Arthur had given it to me along with the keys and the account numbers and the trust documents and the deed to every acre. I opened the door. The room was 20 feet by 30, climate-controlled, with industrial shelving along every wall. On those shelves, sorted and labeled with the same meticulous precision my father brought to his invoices, were containers of precious metals. Drums of copper wire, cleaned and graded by gauge. Bins of stripped circuit boards. Sealed containers of catalytic converter material, each one labeled with the date of extraction, the vehicle source, and the estimated metal content. Separate shelves for the refined product. Small sealed containers of platinum powder, palladium sponge, rhodium in crystalline form. A locked cabinet against the back wall held the most valuable items. Gold recovered from circuit boards and connectors. Silver from electrical contacts. Cobalt and tungsten from industrial machinery components. I stood in that room for an hour. I picked up a container of palladium and held it in my hand. It weighed less than a pound. It was worth more than my father's truck. I thought about every Saturday morning I had spent in this yard, pulling catalytic converters and tossing them into a bin without knowing what they contained. I thought about my father, bent over a workbench in this room after I went home, extracting precious metals by hand, grain by grain, ounce by ounce, building a fortune from the parts that everyone else threw away. He had told me 100 times in 100 different ways, everything has value, Eric. You just have to know where to look. I thought he was talking about cars. He was talking about everything. Arthur walked me through the legal structure. Everything was held in trusts that my father had established through Arthur's firm beginning in 2006. The trusts were irrevocable, properly funded, and specifically designated me as the sole beneficiary. My mother and Kyle were explicitly excluded. There was an anti-contest clause that would void any legal challenge and expose the challenger to forfeiture of any incidental claims against the estate. Your father anticipated a challenge, Arthur said. He prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, thoroughly. The exclusion of your mother and brother is documented with 19 years of contact records, financial transfers, and a sworn statement from your father describing the abandonment in detail. He also included the 3 instances in which your mother contacted him solely to request money, totaling $22,000, none of which was repaid or acknowledged. The case for intentional estrangement is unassailable. I asked about the data center deal. Arthur said the offer was firm and the tech company was eager to close. My father had been negotiating terms up to 2 weeks before his death. The final details were in place. All I had to do was sign. My mother found out within a month. I do not know how. Perhaps Kyle heard something from a former neighbor. Perhaps my mother's name triggered a notification in some probate system. Perhaps someone at the funeral mentioned the attorney. However it happened, Kyle called me on a Sunday evening in March. Eric, what is going on with Dad's estate? Mom heard there is some kind of land deal. There is. How much? That is not your concern, Kyle. Not my concern? He was my father too. He was your father when you were 16 and you walked out of that house without saying goodbye. He was your father for the next 19 years when you did not call, did not visit, did not send a card on his birthday. He was your father when he had cancer and you were not there. He was your father when he died and I was holding his hand and you were sitting in the back of the church checking your phone. He was your father the whole time, Kyle. You just did not want him until you found out he was worth something. That is not fair. You keep using that word. Mom used it too. Do you know what is not fair? Eating gas station sandwiches in a 2-room apartment while your mother redoes her kitchen in Naperville. Working in a junkyard every Saturday while your brother pretends his father does not exist. Holding a man's hand while he dies and knowing that the people who should have been there chose not to be. That is not fair. This is just math. He hung up. He called back the next day with a lawyer's name. I told him about the anti-contest clause. He went quiet. My mother called a week later. I almost did not answer, but I had been holding this conversation in my chest for 19 years, and the weight of it was heavier than anything I had ever pulled from a wrecked car. Eric, I am your mother. I know who you are. I want to understand what is happening with your father's estate. What is happening is what Dad wanted to happen. He left everything to me. The yard, the land, the metals, the investments. All of it. You are not included. Kyle is not included. He was very specific. That cannot be legal. It is legal. It is documented. It is irrevocable. And it is accompanied by 19 years of records showing that you contacted him 3 times, all 3 to ask for money, and never once to ask how he was doing. Silence. I could hear her breathing. I could hear the television in the background, some daytime talk show, the ambient noise of a life lived in comfort while my father sorted metal in the cold. He owed me, she said. I gave him the best years of my life. You gave him 12 years and then you walked out and took his son and called him garbage. He gave you a house. He gave you $22,000 every time you called. He gave you a divorce without a fight. And he spent the next 19 years building an empire in silence while you told everyone who would listen that he would never be anything. An empire. In a junkyard. $33 million, Mom. In a junkyard. The same junkyard you said was garbage. The same man you said would never be anything. He was more than you ever imagined. You just could not see it because you were too busy looking at what other people had. She did not speak for a long time. When she did, her voice was different, smaller. Did he ever forgive me? I thought about that. I thought about 19 years of Saturday mornings and radio stations and sandwiches in silence. I thought about the way my father never spoke my mother's name, not out of anger but out of a completed sadness, the way you stopped mentioning a road you no longer drive. I thought about the letter Arthur had read, and the line that said, "Your mother said I would never be anything." He had carried that sentence for 19 years. He had used it as fuel. He had taken the worst thing anyone ever said to him and turned it into the engine that drove $33 million of quiet, invisible empire building. I thought about the night she left. The blue dress. The 2 suitcases. The way he did not look up from his chili. I used to think he did not look up because he was broken. Now I think he did not look up because he had already decided what he was going to do next. Bobby Novak did not waste time on things he could not change. He spent his energy on things he could build. I do not know, I said. But he built something extraordinary, and he did it after you told him he could not. So maybe forgiveness was not what he needed. Maybe what he needed was to prove you wrong. And he did. Every single day for 19 years. In a junkyard that you called garbage. With a son you left behind. She was crying. I could hear it through the phone. Not the performative crying of someone who wants sympathy. The real kind. The kind that comes from understanding too late that you were wrong about everything. Goodbye, Mom. I hung up. I drove to the yard. I sat in my father's chair in the little office with the radio on and the bare bulb overhead, and I did not cry. I had done enough crying. I ate a gas station sandwich and looked at the corkboard covered in invoices and notes in my father's handwriting, and I felt, for the first time in my life, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I signed the data center deal in April. $24.1 million for 112 acres of land that my father had bought for $67,000. The metals portfolio was liquidated over 6 months through Frank Corrigan's firm, netting $9.2 million after fees and taxes. The junkyard itself was not part of the deal. Kept it. I kept the 6 acres, the corrugated metal shed, the office with the apartment above it, the folding chairs, the radio that still picked up the oldies station. I kept it because it was my father's, and because it was mine, and because some things are not for sale regardless of what they are worth. I still go to the yard on Saturdays. I work it differently now. I hired a crew, a team of 5 guys who pull parts and sort metal and run the daily operations. But on Saturdays I am there. I arrive at 7. I put on my boots. I pull parts, cut metal, eat lunch in the office with the radio on. I sit in the same folding chair my father sat in, at the same desk where he did his books under a bare bulb, in the same space where he ate chili on the night my mother left and did not flinch. The data center is under construction on the land to the north and east. I can see the cranes from the yard. Steel beams rising out of the flat Illinois earth. The skeleton of a building that will store data for millions of people. Built on dirt that my father bought for pennies because he could see what nobody else could see. That this land, this ugly, flat, unwanted land next to a junkyard on Route 394, was going to be worth something someday. The same way he saw that a corroded catalytic converter was worth more than the car it came from. The same way he saw that a Saturday morning with his son was worth more than the wife who walked away. My mother contested the will. Her attorney sent a letter claiming Bobby Novak was mentally compromised during his final years due to cancer treatment, and that the trusts were the product of diminished capacity. Arthur Brennan responded with a 300-page filing that included my father's complete medical records, a cognitive assessment administered 8 months before his death showing full mental capacity, 19 years of detailed financial records demonstrating consistent and sophisticated decision-making, and the complete contact log documenting my mother's abandonment. The filing also included the anti-contest clause and a formal notice that pursuing the challenge would expose my mother to forfeiture of any residual claims and potential liability for legal costs. The challenge was withdrawn in 11 days. Cal sent me a text message 2 months later. It was the longest thing he had ever written to me. He said he was sorry. He said he knew he had made the wrong choice when he was 16. He said he wished he had stayed. He said he understood why Dad left him nothing and he was not going to fight it. He asked if we could get lunch sometime. I read it 3 times. I thought about a 16-year-old kid standing behind his mother with a backpack over one shoulder, choosing the life that looked better on the outside over the one that was real. I thought about how 16 is too young to understand that the man in the work boots is the one you should follow, and how 36 is old enough to realize you chose wrong but too late to undo it. I wrote back, Saturday. The yard. 7 a.m. Bring work boots. He came. He pulled into the gravel lot at 6:55 in a rental car, wearing new work boots that had never touched dirt and a flannel shirt that still had the creases from the packaging. He looked around the yard the way tourists look at foreign cities, with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone who knows they are out of their depth. I handed him a pair of canvas gloves, the same kind my father wore, and we walked to the first row of vehicles without speaking. He did not say much. I did not expect him to. I gave him simple tasks. Pull the battery. Disconnect the alternator. Remove the copper wiring from the harness. He worked slowly, clumsily, the way anyone works who has never held a socket wrench with purpose. His hands blistered within the first hour. He did not complain. I watched him from the corner of my eye and I saw something I did not expect. Concentration. Real concentration. The kind that comes from wanting to do something right, not because you know how, but because you understand, finally, that it matters. At lunch, in the office, eating sandwiches from the same gas station, sitting in folding chairs with the radio playing, he finally spoke. "This is what you did every Saturday?" "Every Saturday. For 19 years. He looked around the office. The bare bulb, the metal desk, the invoices pinned to the corkboard, the stain on the wall where Dad leaned back in his chair every evening. Kyle's eyes were wet. "I should have been here," he said. "Yeah," I said. "You should have." We ate our sandwiches. The radio played. And outside the window, past the chain-link fence and the rows of stripped cars and the flat Illinois horizon, the cranes turned slowly against the sky, building something new on land that everyone else thought was worthless. My father was right. About the land. About the metal. About the catalytic converters and the copper wiring and the zoning maps and the patience it takes to turn nothing into something. He was right about all of it. But the thing he was most right about was the simplest thing he ever said to me. The ones who stay are the ones who inherit. I stayed. Not for the money. I did not know about the money. I stayed because the chili was warm and the man who made it was my father, and sometimes that is enough. Sometimes staying is the whole thing. The entire act. The complete measure of who you are and what you believe and how much weight you can carry without breaking. My father carried the weight of a junkyard and a broken family and a wife who said he would never be anything. He carried it for 30 years. He carried it quietly, without complaining, without asking for sympathy, without telling anyone what he was building underneath. $33 million. In a junkyard. On land nobody wanted. In metal nobody valued. Built by a man nobody saw. Except me. I saw him. Every Saturday. For 19 years. That is the inheritance. Not the money. Not the land. Not the data center deal or the precious metals portfolio or the trusts that Arthur Brennan constructed with the precision of a master architect. The real inheritance is this. I was there. I showed up. I pulled parts and ate sandwiches and sat in silence with a man who deserved better than what life gave him and who built something extraordinary anyway. The ones who stay are the ones who inherit. I stayed. Thank you for walking this journey with me. Before you go, I have left 2 more stories here on your screen. Both from men who discovered that family is not always who you are born to. It is who stands by you when the truth comes out. Click on whichever one calls to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it is like to be the outsider looking in, that notification bell is your invitation. Until tomorrow, remember, your story matters, even if they tried to erase it.